Imagine walking into a tent in the middle of a dusty ancient desert. I mean, from the outside, it looks completely unassuming.
Right. It's just a structure covered in, like, tough, weather-beaten animal skin.
Exactly, just rough skins.
Yes.
But then you pull back this heavy entrance curtain, you step inside, and suddenly you discover that the interior of this tent is a literal architectural copy of the control room of the universe.
Which is just wild to think about because, today we are looking at blueprints, but definitely not the kind made of paper.
No, definitely not.
Or the kind that a modern contractor uses to build a concrete parking garage, right? Because when we think of blueprints today, we expect something very binary.
Yeah, we expect math.
Exactly. Mathematics, load-bearing walls, electrical grids. We think it's entirely confined to the physical materials just sitting on the dirt in front of you.
Right.
But when you step into the world of ancient biblical architecture, specifically the Israelite tabernacle, that straightforward expectation is just completely upended.
It really is. And welcome to another deep dive. If you are listening to this, you are probably what we like to call the learner.
The best kind of listener.
Yep, you're that insanely curious person who wants the deep knowledge, the multiple perspectives, and the profound connections. But, without feeling like you're drowning in a sea of academic jargon.
Right. You want the insight, you want the aha moments, and you want to actually understand how it applies to reality.
Exactly. And today, you've brought us a stack of source material that is exactly that.
Yeah.
I mean, it is dense, it is highly academic, and honestly, it is just endlessly fascinating.
It really is. I mean, the sources you provided form this comprehensive interdisciplinary text. It's exploring the exegetical, theological, pastoral, and practical foundations of the Old Testament law on the tabernacle.
Yeah, but it's analyzing them through a very specific lens, right?
Yes, it views them as shadows of heavenly realities.
Shadows of heavenly realities. That is just such a beautiful phrase. And, well, it sets up the core premise we're exploring today. The idea that the ancient laws, the incredibly detailed cultic institutions, the animal sacrifices.
I love it.
Right, and that physical, movable tent of the tabernacle in ancient Israel, I mean, none of it was the ultimate reality.
No, it wasn't the end point at all.
Instead, the sources argue that all of these things were divinely orchestrated prefigurations. They were shadows cast by a substance. And that substance, according to the New Testament framework we'll be discussing, is found entirely in the person and work of Jesus Christ.
And we need to establish right up front why this isn't just some dusty, abstract theology lesson.
Right. Why should you care?
Exactly. This deep dive is a journey to understand how a single, incredibly potent metaphorical concept, the shadow, has drastically shaped centuries of human philosophy.
It's everywhere.
It really is. So we're going to decode the specific ancient Greek and Hebrew vocabulary that built this idea. We'll explore some frankly mind-bending concepts about how time and space interact.
Oh, I can't wait for that part.
Yeah, and then we will impartially evaluate how vastly different church traditions handle the fallout of this framework. And finally, we'll look at how it radically transforms the way a person interacts with, like, a sick neighbor today.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to really understand the shadow, we have to start with the language that originally built the concept.
We do.
The New Testament framework for this relies heavily on a very specific set of Greek vocabulary words, mostly found in the book of Hebrews and the letter to the Colossians. We're looking at words like skia, soma, hypodegma, typos, and antitypon.
And, if we want to really grasp the gravity of this, we have to treat these words not just as simple translations.
Right.
They are conceptual anchors that the biblical authors were using to completely reorient how their readers viewed the world.
So let's start with the big contrast, right? Skia and soma.
Yeah, perfect starting point.
So skia translates directly to shadow, and soma translates to body or substance. The text points us specifically to Colossians chapter 2, verse 17. The author is talking about all these intense Old Testament regulations like dietary laws, religious festivals, Sabbaths, and he says these are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ.
What is so brilliant here is the precise physical phenomenon that the biblical authors are leveraging to make their theological point.
Okay, break that down.
Well, the Greek word skia originally denoted a dark outline caused by an object partially blocking light. Just Think about the literal physics of a shadow for a second.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
It provides a real representation of the object casting it. It has the accurate contour. You can look at a shadow and tell if it's a tree or a dog or a person, right?
Yeah, you can recognize the shape.
But it is entirely secondary, it is derivative, it is insubstantial, and most importantly, it has no independent existence whatsoever.
Oh, wow, yeah.
It only exists because the solid object, the soma, the body, is interacting with the light.
So it's just a silhouette. I mean, it lacks color, it lacks depth, it lacks mass. You can't, like, embrace a shadow.
Exactly. You can't hug a shadow. So, used metaphorically in this framework, saying the Levitical sacrificial system is a skia means it possessed the accurate contour of God's redemptive plan.
Right, the shape was right.
Exactly. It perfectly outlined the concepts of atonement, sacrifice, and mediation. But it lacked independent material or a salvific reality.
That makes so much sense.
A shadow corresponds perfectly to its source, but its pedagogical function, its teaching purpose, is entirely lost once the actual source is physically standing right in front of you.
And the sources describe this as a physics metaphor, but with a massive, almost sci-fi twist involving time.
Oh yeah, this is where it gets crazy.
Because normally, a solid body casts a shadow across the surface in the present moment. But in this theological framework, the physical, incarnate, crucified, and resurrected body of Christ is casting a shadow backward across time.
Yes, backward into the Old Testament era.
My brain is kind of breaking a little bit here. I mean, in physics, a shadow falls away from the light source in the present moment.
Yeah.
But you're saying this theological shadow was cast backward, like centuries into the past.
It is a stunning visual, isn't it?
It really is.
The substance, the soma, exists definitively in the 1st century AD with the historical arrival of Jesus. But the light of divine revelation shines on that substance in such a way that the shadow it casts stretches backward for centuries.
Why?
It falls over Mount Sinai, it falls over Moses, and it provides the exact shape and structure for the ancient Israelite institutions. The shadow literally arrived before the body did.
I was trying to picture this earlier, and it's like, well, imagine you're standing on a sidewalk at high noon. Your best friend walks up from behind you, and their shadow falls on the pavement in front of you.
Okay, yeah.
Clinging to the Old Testament law after Christ's arrival would be like dropping to your knees, staring at that dark, two-dimensional shadow on the concrete, and trying to have a deep, meaningful conversation with it, while you were just completely ignoring the brilliant, three-dimensional, living, breathing person who is standing right next to you, who is actually casting the shadow in the first place.
That is a perfect illustration. You are interacting with the derivative outline rather than the reality itself. And the author of Hebrews uses another critical Greek word to expand on this relational dynamic.
Okay, what's the word?
Hypodegma, which is found in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5. Here, the earthly Levitical priests are described as serving a copy and shadow of the heavenly things.
So hypodegma is the copy part of that phrase.
Correct. It means a representation or an earthly model that's derived from a heavenly original. And this is often paired with two more really vital concepts, typos and antitypon.
Right, so typos, which is where we get our English word type or typical, is a pattern. And the antitypon is the counterpart, the antitype.
But here is where we have to be incredibly precise, because the New Testament uses these words on two entirely different axes.
Right, the sources mention this.
Yeah, there is a horizontal axis and there is a vertical axis.
Okay, I think I get the horizontal one. The horizontal axis is temporal, right? It's about time and history moving forward on a timeline.
Exactly.
Like the sources point to 1 Peter chapter 3, where the Apostle Peter uses antitypon horizontally. He looks back at the historical waters of Noah's flood.
Right.
And he identifies the flood as a past type, a typos, that foreshadows a future reality. It points forward chronologically to the present antitype, which he says is Christian baptism.
That's spot on.
So it's a historical event prefiguring a later historical event. It moves in a straight, horizontal line across human history.
That is exactly right. But the vertical axis completely changes the geometry of how we read these texts.
How so?
Well, the vertical axis is spatial. It's about geography, specifically the geography of heaven and earth.
So interesting.
Yeah, in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24, the author flips the linguistic usage completely. The text says that Christ did not enter holy places made with hands, which are merely copies, antitype of the true things, but into heaven itself.
Hold on, if I'm hearing you right, in Peter's letter, The earthly historical thing in the present is the antitype.
Yes.
But in Hebrews, the earthly thing is the antitype to a heavenly reality.
Precisely. In Hebrews, the eternal heavenly reality is the original typos, the ultimate pattern, and the earthly, material, physical tabernacle built by Moses is the antitype.
Ah, got it.
It's the derived, inferior copy that sits physically below it. It is a vertical relationship. Heaven is the original blueprint. Earth is the localized copy.
So this bidirectional typology means the Old Testament sacrificial system was doing two things at once.
It was multitasker, yeah.
Horizontally, it was pointing forward as a prophetic shadow to the historical incarnation and crucifixion of Jesus. But vertically, it was pointing upward to the eternal heavenly reality of atonement in the presence of God. It's basically working on an X and Y axis simultaneously.
It served a dual pedagogical function. It taught the ancient Israelites about both the future trajectory of redemptive history and the present spatial reality of heaven's throne room.
But doesn't that sort of contradict the lived experience of the Israelites?
What do you mean?
I mean, if these Old Testament practices, the sacrifices, the festivals, the tabernacle, if they were just shadows, just derivative copies, does that mean they were fake? Or, like, useless to the people doing them at the time? Were they just going through the motions of a cosmic pantomime while waiting for the real thing to show up?
That is a crucial pushback, and the sources actually anticipate it. The answer is absolutely not. They were not fake.
Yeah.
They were intensely real. They involved real blood, real animals, real architecture, and they were pedagogically crucial for their specific era.
So they had a real purpose.
Oh, definitely. They provided a real, objective framework for the Israelites to understand the gravity of sin, the absolute necessity of mediation, and the terrifying holiness of God. They were the authorized means of grace for that covenantal period.
Right.
However, they were not the ultimate salvific reality. The shadow was a necessary divine teaching tool, but its utility had a divinely appointed expiration date.
It was real, it was necessary, but it wasn't the final reality. That makes sense. But, knowing the vocabulary is one thing. How did this vertical heavenly shadow actually manifest in physical space on Earth?
That's where the architecture comes in.
Right, because it wasn't just a philosophy. It was a physical tent that people had to pack up and carry through the desert. Which brings us to the bizarre and highly specific architecture of the ancient tabernacle.
And this is where that vertical axis we just discussed becomes breathtakingly literal. Hebrews 8:5 quotes the book of Exodus, specifically Exodus 25:40, where God is giving Moses the incredibly tedious, detailed instructions for building the tabernacle.
Yeah, very detailed.
God says, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain."
And the sources highlight that the Hebrew word for pattern there is tabnit.
Yes, tabnit. It denotes a model, a structure, a divine architectural blueprint. When Moses was up on Mount Sinai, he wasn't just getting a list of moral laws engraved on stone. He was being shown a visionary, heavenly reality. And he was told to build a physical, earthly, localized replica of it.
And what blew my mind in the sources is the observation about how this blueprint was structured. It was an intentional, structural inversion of the creation account in Genesis chapters 1 and 2.
It is a profound literary and architectural move. Think about how Genesis builds the world. It works outside in.
Okay, outside in.
First, God creates the macrocosmos, right? The heavens, the earth, the seas. Then he fills it with plants, then animals, and finally, right at the absolute center, he creates the inhabitants of the Garden of Eden. Outside, moving inward to the center of divine communion.
But the instructions for the tabernacle in Exodus go in the exact opposite direction. They go inside out.
Exact.
The blueprint starts with the absolute innermost furnishing, the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies. Then it moves outward to the holy place with the table of showbread and the menorah.
Right.
Then it moves outward again to the curtains, the structural tent fabrics, and finally out to the exterior bronze altar in the dusty courtyard.
The items described in Exodus are portrayed as having a heavenly origin. They conceptually descend from the mountain, and Moses is erecting a tent on earth to house them.
It's like a reverse build.
Yeah, the tabernacle functioned as a microcosmos. It was a miniaturized recreation of the Garden of Eden, a highly localized space where the divine presence could overlap with the fallen earth.
The details of the architectural layering are just stunning when you view it this way. The innermost curtains of the tabernacle, the ones right around the ark, were heavily embroidered with angelic cherubim.
Yes, guarding the presence.
Just like the cherubim that were stationed to guard the entrance to Eden after the fall, The inner sanctuary was filled with floral motifs carved into the menorah, gold, precious jewels.
Very Edenic imagery.
But then, as you move outward, the materials change. They become less precious and more durable. The outermost layer of the tent, the part actually exposed to the harsh wilderness elements, was made of incredibly tough skins.
Yes.
Our sources mention aquatic mammal skins, often translated as dugong or badger skins.
And what that structural inversion actually symbolizes is breathtaking. Because the tabernacle is built inside out compared to creation, with the most heavenly materials on the inside and the roughest materials on the outside, it symbolizes that when heaven descends to earth, it slips secretly into the heart of the material world.
The roof of the world becomes its foundation.
Yes. The dazzling, jewel-encrusted, angelic reality of heaven is crammed into the center, completely hidden from the outside world by rough, weather-beaten, waterproof animal skins. Just as Adam functioned as a priest-king in the primordial garden temple, the Levitical priests ministered in a sanctuary explicitly designed to mirror these heavenly realities. The earthly tabernacle was an exact, material, shadowy replication of the heavenly throne room.
You know what this reminds me of? It's kind of like the TARDIS from Doctor Who.
Oh, the TARDIS.
Or like one of those magical tents you read about in fantasy novels, like in Harry Potter. I mean, from the outside, it is completely unassuming. It's just a localized, rough, waterproof, earthly exterior sitting in the middle of a desert.
Right, it doesn't look like much at all.
But you step through that curtain, and suddenly you're standing inside a massive, heavenly reality. It contains an entire microcosmos crammed into a localized space.
That is a highly effective way to visualize it. It was a localized access point. The divine presence was tabernacling, pitching a tent among a redeemed yet inherently sinful people.
But, if the tabernacle was an earthly copy of a heavenly reality, it forces an immediate, massive philosophical problem.
Oh, absolutely.
What exactly is heaven? I mean, is heaven a physical place? Is it a floating room somewhere in the cosmos made of literal gold and jewels? Is it just a philosophical idea of perfection? Or is it a time?
And that question pulls us directly into the philosophical and cultural backgrounds of this text, specifically the historical tension between Greek Platonism, Jewish apocalypticism, and a concept known as spatiotemporal eschatology.
Spatiotemporal eschatology. Okay, I'm going to need you to explain that to me like I'm 5 in a minute, because that sounds like a college course I would definitely fail.
We'll get there, don't worry.
But before we get there, the sources talk about a major historical scholarly debate regarding whoever wrote the book of Hebrews. For a long time, the dominant academic theory was that the author was just borrowing heavily from Greek Platonism, specifically the ideas of the Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria.
Right, because Platonism operates on a strict metaphysical dualism between the ideal and the material. If you remember Plato's allegory of the cave from his Republic.
Where people are chained in a cave facing a blank wall, and they only see shadows of objects passing in front of a fire behind them.
Yes, that's the warning.
They think the shadows are reality, but the true ideal forms are outside the cave.
Exactly. In Platonic thought, the material, physical world is merely a shadowy, inferior reflection of eternal, heavenly ideas or forms. Matter is inherently lesser, sometimes even viewed as bad or corrupt. So, for decades, scholars read Hebrews talking about shadows and copies, and basically assumed the author was just applying Plato's cave to the Old Testament. Philo himself actually quoted that exact same verse we discussed, Exodus 25:40, to argue for a strict dualism between the ideal and the material.
But the sources say the modern scholarly consensus has shifted dramatically away from Plato and toward Jewish apocalypticism. They point to the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the Qumran community.
This is where understanding historical context changes everything.
Okay, tell me more.
When scholars started translating and analyzing the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly a text called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, which is also known as the Angel Liturgy, they found compelling evidence that the concept of a heavenly sanctuary was already deeply embedded in first-century Palestinian Judaism.
So it wasn't some Greek import, it was a homegrown Jewish idea.
Exactly. This Qumran text describes a spiritual sevenfold temple in heaven where God's throne is a chariot, a merkabah, and angelic priests conduct continuous worship.
Oh, fascinating.
The Qumran community believed their earthly liturgical rites connected directly with this heavenly reality. You see similar things in other Jewish writings from the period, which talk about apocalyptic visions of a holy temple in heaven.
Okay, but playing devil's advocate here, why does it matter whether Hebrews got this from Plato or from Qumran? Like, does it actually change the meaning of the text for the reader?
Oh, it changes the meaning fundamentally. The contrast is stark.
How so?
In Platonism, the earthly shadow is inferior simply because it is made of physical matter. Matter is bad, ideas are good. But in the theology of Hebrews and Jewish apocalypticism, the earthly shadow is passing away not because matter is inherently bad or evil. God created the material world and called it good, after all.
Right. I mean, the incarnation itself means God took on physical matter.
Exactly. The shadow is passing away because the eschatological age has definitively shifted.
Okay, pause. Eschatological. For anyone who didn't go to seminary, when we say eschatological, we're basically talking about the ultimate climax of history, right? The end of days reality.
Yes. Eschatology is the study of the end times, the ultimate destiny of humanity and the cosmos. So when we say the eschatological age has shifted, we mean that the realities of the end of the world, like the resurrection, the final dwelling of God with man, have unexpectedly crashed into the middle of present history through Jesus.
Wow, okay.
It is a historical and redemptive transition, not just a metaphysical one. The heavenly sanctuary in Hebrews is not just a static, timeless, platonic ideal floating in the ether. It is a dynamic, eschatological reality that has been decisively inaugurated by the historical ascension of Jesus Christ.
So it's about timelines intersecting, not just escaping the physical world.
Correct.
The sources apply a really fascinating spatial theory to this. From a scholar named Edward Soja, it's a tripartite or three-part spatial theory applied to the tabernacle.
Yes, Soja delineates 3 dimensions of space, which helps us understand this complex spatio-temporal eschatology we mentioned earlier.
Let's walk through the 3 spaces. First space is the physical or material space. This is the literal earthly tabernacle built by Moses and later the stone temples in Jerusalem. The text says these structures serve their pedagogical purpose, but they were inherently flawed, subject to decay, and destined for destruction.
Then you have second space, which is the conceptual or ideal space. This is the divine blueprint that tabnit shown to Moses on the mountain.
Right.
This is the archetypal pattern existing in the mind and revelation of God. It's the concept that guided the construction of the first space.
And finally, third space, the lived or actualized space. This is the heavenly sanctuary itself, which was decisively actualized by the resurrection and ascension of Christ.
Yes.
The sources say that when Jesus entered the heavenly tabernacle, he eschatologically situated and oriented believers, allowing them to spiritually occupy that sanctuary space in the presence of God.
And the defining historical moment that proves this shift from first space to third space was the tearing of the temple veil at the crucifixion.
Such a powerful image.
It is. That event signifies that the boundary between the earthly and the heavenly, between the shadow and the substance, has been irrevocably breached. Believers are no longer restricted to the outer courts of a physical temple, trembling in fear at the foot of Mount Sinai. They have, according to Hebrews 12, already come to Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem.
Okay, I am tracking with the transition from the physical tent to the heavenly reality. But I still need to push you on the literal versus metaphor aspect.
Okay, lay it on me.
If Christ physically ascended with a physical resurrected body and bodies have to occupy space, does that mean heaven is a literal architectural room somewhere in the cosmos? Or is it entirely a metaphor for a spiritual state?
That is the exact crux of spatiotemporal eschatology. According to the sources, it is actually both.
Wolf.
It is a spatial reality because Christ has a resurrected body and bodies must occupy space. So there is a where in which the exalted Christ intercedes, but it is also a temporal eschatological reality. It represents the ultimate unmediated dwelling of God with humanity. It is the future age crashing into the present moment. So it is a real space, but it is a space that belongs to the new creation, the age to come, which mysteriously overlaps with our current reality.
It's the TARDIS again, a reality that is bigger on the inside, overlapping with our world, but belonging to a different dimension of time and space.
Precisely. It really is the TARDIS.
Okay, so if the veil in the literal Jerusalem temple was torn in half, and this physical first space tent is now definitively obsolete, I mean, that creates an immediate massive headache for the early church, and frankly, for theologians today.
It certainly does.
What do they do with the giant scroll of rules Moses gave them? Do they just toss it out?
That is the million-dollar theological question. Once you establish that the Old Testament law and the tabernacle were shadows, and the substance has arrived in Christ, systematic theologians have to figure out the exact mechanics of continuity and discontinuity. To what extent does the Old Testament law remain binding on a person today?
And just a quick reminder to you listening, we are completely impartial here. We are not taking sides in these theological debates. We are simply presenting the fascinating, highly structured frameworks derived from our sources, because seeing how different groups solve this massive puzzle is just incredible.
Absolutely. The foundational question of how the shadows operate in the post-fulfillment era has birthed three major macro-hermeneutical systems. Let's start with the first one outlined in the sources, covenant theology, which is deeply rooted in the Reformed tradition.
Covenant theology uses something called the tripartite division of the law. Tripartite meaning three parts. They look at the massive tangled block of the 613 laws in the Mosaic covenant and divide them into three distinct buckets: moral, ceremonial, and civil.
Yes. Theologians like Francis Turretin, John Calvin, and even stretching back to Thomas Aquinas utilize this framework to organize the chaos. Let's break down the three categories. First, the moral law.
The moral law is essentially the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. The overarching principles of love for God and neighbor: do not murder, do not steal. And in covenant theology, this bucket is considered perpetually binding on all humans at all times.
Correct. They argue that the moral law reflects the immutable, unchangeable character of God. Therefore, it transcends the Mosaic covenant entirely and remains the absolute guide for Christian sanctification today.
The second bucket is the ceremonial law. This includes the tabernacle architecture we just talked about, the sacrificial system, the priesthood, the dietary laws prohibiting pork or shellfish, the festival calendar.
And this is the bucket that is intrinsically tied to our core theme today. In covenant theology, the ceremonial law is entirely abrogated, meaning it is canceled or fulfilled.
Because they were the shadows.
Yes, these are the literal shadows pointing to Christ. From this perspective, to continue practicing these ceremonies today would be a reversion to spiritual immaturity. It would be an implicit denial that the substance, Christ, has truly arrived.
We'll be talking to the shadow on the pavement again.
Exactly. And the third bucket is the civil or judicial law. This is the jurisprudence governing the ancient theocratic nation-state of Israel. That's specific crimes, punishments, property laws, tax codes.
Okay, I have to push back on this system a bit, because I've read some of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and it is weird.
It can definitely be challenging to modern readers.
The sources say covenant theology believes these civil laws expired with the ancient state of Israel, but that their general equity remains valid. What does general equity mean when we are talking about some of the bizarre laws in the Old Testament?
What kind of laws are you thinking of?
Like, Deuteronomy says if you build a new house, you have to put a parapet, a little wall, around your flat roof. Or the laws about not mixing two types of fabric in your clothing. How do the three buckets handle that today?
That is exactly where the friction lies in this system. For the roof parapet, a covenant theologian would say that was a civil law. It applied specifically to ancient Israelite architecture where people entertained guests on flat roofs. You don't have a flat roof today, so you don't need a parapet.
Makes sense.
However, the general equity, the underlying moral principle, is that you must protect people from negligence on your property. That principle is eternal because it stems from the moral law of loving your neighbor and not murdering them through negligence. So today, that might mean putting a fence around your swimming pool.
Okay, that makes logical sense. But what about mixing fabrics? Or the intense rules in Leviticus about how a priest has to inspect the mildew in your house?
The mixed fabrics would likely be categorized under the ceremonial bucket. It was a physical, outward shadow designed to teach the Israelites about the concept of holiness and separation, not mixing the holy with the profane. Since the substance of holiness has arrived in Christ, the shadow of fabric separation is obsolete.
Ah, I see.
The mildew laws functioned similarly. They were bio-ritual laws about ceremonial purity and defilement that pointed to the contagion of sin.
But the sources note that this threefold division faces massive criticism from modern scholars. Because when you actually read the text, the biblical authors never say, okay, here are the moral laws, and over here in this other chapter are the ceremonial ones. It's all mixed together.
That is the primary critique. Critics argue that this tripartite division is an artificial scholastic construct imposed on the text centuries later.
The sources use the Sabbath as the ultimate example of this tension. The Sabbath command, keeping the seventh day holy, is right there in the Ten Commandments. So, according to the system, it should be strictly in the moral bucket and perpetually binding.
Right.
But it possesses incredibly strong ceremonial and ritual elements. It's a shadow of future rest, according to Colossians, which should put it in the ceremonial bucket. And in ancient Israel, breaking it had severe civil and criminal penalties, which puts it in the civil bucket. It basically bleeds across all three lines simultaneously.
It does. It crosses every line. Despite these critiques, defenders of the threefold division maintain that it is a good and necessary consequence of biblical theology. They argue it is the only system that effectively explains why the New Testament treats different Mosaic commands in such drastically different ways.
Like what?
Like why the Apostle Paul emphatically says you shouldn't murder, but in the same breath says it's perfectly fine to eat pork.
Okay, so that's covenant theology's attempt to sort the rules.
Yeah.
The second major system our sources outline is progressive covenantalism, which is closely related to New Covenant theology. And this system looks at the three buckets and says, nope, that's not how this works.
Exactly. They argue for the essential indivisible unity of the Mosaic covenant. They don't see three buckets, they see one massive, singular covenantal package. And according to this perspective, the entire law of Moses, every single bit of it, from murder to mildew, was a temporary historical covenant designed with planned obsolescence.
Planned obsolescence. I love that phrasing. I compare it to a software operating system. Progressive covenantalism views the Old Testament law as Moses OS.
Moses OS, I like that.
Yeah, it was a complete unified operating system designed by God, and it worked perfectly for its specific time and its specific hardware, the ancient Israelites living in the land of Canaan. But it had planned obsolescence built into the base code. When Christ arrived, believers were upgraded to an entirely new system, Christ OS 2.0.
That is a very accurate analogy for this framework. When the Apostle Paul says believers are no longer under the law, progressive covenantalists argue he isn't just talking about the ceremonial bucket of sacrifices. He is talking about the entire Mosaic administration, including the Ten Commandments as they were specifically codified for Israel. The whole law was a shadow and a guardian until the fullness of time.
But wait, if they say the Ten Commandments are obsolete as a covenant, does that mean they think Christians have no moral rules, that it's just a free-for-all?
Oh, not at all. They argue that Christians are now under the law of Christ, as mentioned in 1 Corinthians 9, or the law of the New Covenant. Now, the law of Christ certainly reiterates 9 of the 10 Commandments, everything except the Sabbath, but it does so based on the authority of Christ, not the authority of Moses.
So they still value the Old Testament, just differently.
Yes. The Old Testament law remains inherently valuable as Christian scripture. It functions as a prophetic shadow, revealing the wisdom, character, and righteousness of God. You can look back at the old code to understand the mind of the designer, but its direct, covenantal, and legal authority over the believer has been entirely superseded by the inauguration of the New Covenant.
It's obsolete software, even if we still appreciate the historic code.
Okay.
Okay, so we have covenant theology's three buckets and progressive covenantalism's planned obsolescence. The third system is dispensationalism, and this one introduces a wildly unique and frankly controversial theological dynamic regarding the shadows.
Dispensationalism agrees with the others that the church is not currently bound by the Mosaic law. However, it emphasizes a sharp, enduring, and perpetual distinction between national, ethnic Israel and the New Testament church.
Right.
It argues that unconditional promises made to the ethnic descendants of Abraham, promises regarding territorial land in the Middle East, a literal Davidic throne, and a rebuilt temple must be fulfilled literally on earth.
And this fulfillment, according to this framework, happens during a future 1,000-year millennial kingdom after Christ returns. But this creates a massive, glaring theological tension regarding our entire theme of shadows and substance.
It creates a profound tension. If the earthly sanctuary was a shadow pointing to Christ, and Christ has fulfilled the sacrificial system once and for all, as the book of Hebrews explicitly repeatedly states, why does the prophet Ezekiel, in chapters 40 through 48, describe a highly detailed future temple complete with a restored Levitical priesthood and ongoing animal sacrifices?
Right. If the whole point of Hebrews is that we moved permanently from the shadowy derivative copy to the heavenly substance, wouldn't building a future physical temple with literal animal sacrifices feel like going backward, like willfully returning to the shadow?
That is exactly the critique leveled against it by other camps. But the sources detail how dispensational scholars resolve this tension, and they do so with careful, highly specific nuance. They absolutely insist that these future millennial sacrifices will not serve to expiate sin.
Hold on, expiate, that means to pay the penalty for, or to wipe away, right?
Yes, to make atonement for guilt. Dispensationalists agree that to say these future sacrifices forgave sin would be a direct heresy, a direct contradiction of Hebrews 10, which says it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Only Christ's substance does that.
Okay, so if they aren't for forgiving sin, what on earth are they doing sacrificing literal animals in a future perfect kingdom?
Dispensationalists understand these future sacrifices in two primary ways. First, as memorial sacrifices. They argue that, much like the Eucharist or communion looks back to the cross in the current church age, these millennial sacrifices will look back to the finished work of Christ.
Oh.
They will serve as highly visible, visceral, pedagogical memorials for mortals with unresurrected bodies who are living in that future earthly kingdom.
A visceral, physical, bloody reminder of the cost of the cross.
Exactly. The second reason they offer is for ceremonial cleansing. According to this framework, during the millennium, the Shekinah glory of God, his intense radiating presence, will once again dwell literally on earth in Jerusalem, amidst mortal humans who survive the tribulation and still possess sinful natures.
Okay.
Therefore, animal sacrifices will be required for finite ceremonial cleansing of the physical space. It purges the sanctuary of human defilement so that a holy God can dwell among an earthly populace without his radiating presence literally consuming them.
Wow. That is a highly mechanical view of holiness in space. But as you mentioned, the sources note that critics of dispensationalism push back hard on this. They mention amillennial and postmillennial scholars.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, amillennial means they don't believe in a literal future 1,000-year political kingdom, but see the millennium as a symbol for the current church age.
Correct. And from the covenantal amillennial perspective, the transition from the earthly tabernacle to the heavenly sanctuary is permanent, definitive, and irreversible. You never go back to the types.
Never go back.
Right. They view Ezekiel's temple not as a literal future blueprint for a construction project, but as an apocalyptic typological vision. They believe it is being fulfilled spiritually in the church today and will be ultimately consummated in the New Jerusalem. They argue that reinstituting animal sacrifices, even just as memorials, is fundamentally a regressive step in redemptive history.
It is so fascinating how one concept, the shadow giving way to the substance, can produce such radically different yet internally consistent frameworks for understanding the entire timeline of human history. We've got buckets, we've got software upgrades, and we've got future memorial temples.
And these theological frameworks do more than just dictate textbook theology or chart out the end times. They literally dictate the lived reality of believers. They determine what you might see, smell, hear, and experience when you walk into a church on Sunday morning.
Which brings us to the final major section of our deep dive, liturgy, sacraments, and the contagion of holiness. Because the transition from the shadow to the substance profoundly shapes the pastoral care, the architecture, and the worship practices of the Christian church today.
Let's examine how different ecclesiastical traditions apply this transition. The sources begin with the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, which place a massive emphasis on participation in the heavenly liturgy.
In Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox theology, what happens on Sunday morning is not just a psychological memorial. It's not just a group of people getting together in a room to remember something nice that happened 2,000 years ago.
No, it is understood as a mystical, real-time participation in the ongoing, eternal heavenly liturgy. Because Christ is the eternal high priest ministering in the true third space tabernacle right now, the worship of the church on earth is actually caught up into that heavenly sanctuary. The veil is thin.
The sources mention that in this tradition, the Eucharist, the Mass, or the Divine Liturgy, is a representation of Christ's once-for-all sacrifice. And they put a hyphen in that word, representation, not a re-crucifixion.
That hyphen is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and it is a vital distinction rooted in ancient theology. The church is not offering a new sacrifice. They are not killing Jesus again. They are carrying out the memorial of the salvation-bringing sacrifice by beholding the image, the typon, and being drawn into the reality of the passion. The earthly altar in a Catholic or Orthodox church becomes the literal nexus point between heaven and earth. It echoes the function of the ancient tabernacle, but it is infused with the actual substance of the new covenant, rather than being a mere shadow.
And this theology heavily influences the architecture of the buildings themselves. The sources talk about how the physical church building is deliberately designed to reflect this journey. The nave, the main room where the congregation sits, is typically oriented longitudinally, pointing straight down the aisle toward the sanctuary and the altar. It symbolizes the pilgrim church's journey toward the beatific vision.
Hold up, beatific vision, that sounds like something out of Dante. What does that actually mean?
Oh, wait, I'm the host, you're the expert, but I actually know this.
Oh, lay it on me.
The beatific vision is a theological term for the ultimate direct self-communication of God to the individual person. It means finally seeing God face to face in heaven, which brings perfect, ultimate happiness. The architecture points you toward that future reality.
Spot on.
Furthermore, the physical tabernacle within a Catholic parish, the ornate, often golden box behind the altar where the consecrated bread is reserved, functions as the localized epicenter of God's dwelling. It draws a direct typological line straight back to the ancient Ark of the Covenant. But crucially, they believe it contains the literal substance, the real presence, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, rather than a shadowy artifact like the tablets of stone or Aaron's staff.
And this spatial reality also undergirds their doctrine of the communion of saints. Because the church exists simultaneously on earth and in the heavenly sanctuary, the saints in heaven, the cloud of witnesses, are actively participating in the liturgy. They intercede for the pilgrim church on earth, much like the cherubim populated the imagery of the earthly tabernacle.
Which is a beautiful continuity of imagery. Now, the sources contrast this with the Lutheran tradition. Lutherans similarly place an incredibly high emphasis on the real presence of Christ in the sacrament of the altar, but they interpret the shadow and substance motif through their foundational theological distinction between law and gospel.
For Lutherans, the Old Testament shadows like the manna falling in the wilderness, the water flowing from the rock, the blood of the covenant sprinkled on the people, these were true provisions of grace. But they merely prefigured the ultimate provision, the true body and blood of Christ given for the forgiveness of sins.
And Lutheran devotional writers make a point that echoes our earlier analogy about the shadow on the sidewalk. One would never settle for looking at a two-dimensional dark shadow if they had the option of interacting with the brilliantly colored, detailed reality of the person casting it. The shadows cast the silhouette of the font and the chalice, but the substance is vastly superior.
The sources point out a really interesting pastoral application here. For Lutherans, the reality of the New Covenant provides objective, external assurance.
Yes, and this is deeply pastoral. Believers in this tradition are taught not to rely on speculative mysticism or fluctuating internal emotional states to find God.
Right, they don't have to look inward.
Exactly. They don't have to wonder if they feel spiritual enough or if they tried hard enough this week. They find God exactly where He has objectively promised to be located, in the tangible substance of the Word and the sacraments. The physical water, the physical bread, the physical wine.
This objective presence drives a profound reverence. The physical act of crossing oneself upon entering the church or receiving the sacrament is a bodily reminder that the believer has been brought out of the shadows and marked by the reality of the cross.
Moving to the Reformed and evangelical traditions, the application of the shadow and substance motif pivots slightly. Here it is primarily applied to assure the believer's conscience of complete forgiveness and to fiercely protect the church against the encroachment of legalism.
Drawing heavily on Hebrews 9 and 10, evangelical pastors emphasize that the endless daily repetition of animal sacrifices in the Old Testament served as a constant reminder of sin. It proved conclusively that the shadow, the blood of bulls and goats, could never actually perfect the worshiper. If it worked, they would have stopped sacrificing.
Exactly. The shadows provided a temporary judicial covering, but they could never internally cleanse the conscience. In stark contrast, the substance, the singular, perfect, once-for-all sacrifice of Christ, purifies the conscience entirely.
And the pastoral result of this is profound spiritual rest. Believers are urged to cease striving to earn salvation through moral performance. Because the substance has arrived, they have unprecedented boldness to enter the most holy place directly. No earthly priesthood required.
Additionally, the sources note that this framework provides a pastoral bulwark against legalism. If the dietary laws and festival calendars were merely shadows cast by the approaching reality of Christ, imposing them as binding obligations on New Covenant believers is a severe theological error.
Right. If you use those shadows as a marker of superior spirituality, or as a means of justification, you are entirely missing the point. The sources insist that while believers can appreciate the historical value of biblical festivals, like hosting a Passover Seder to understand the history, they must never be used as grounds for condemnation or division within the church.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most transformative practical implication for Christian living discussed in our sources: the concept of spiritual geography and the contagion of holiness.
I found this part utterly fascinating.
It's so good.
Spiritual geography. If the heavenly tabernacle is the true reality, and believers are united to Christ who ministers in it, the Christian possesses a dual citizenship. By faith, the believer is already seated with Christ in the heavenly places. They're spiritually occupying that third space we talked about earlier.
This spatial reorientation alters everything about how a Christian interacts with the material world. In the New Covenant, every believer is inducted into a royal priesthood. The cultic language of the Old Testament, offering sacrifices, burning incense, maintaining purity, tending the lamps, it's transposed onto the everyday ethical and spiritual behavior of the Christian.
It turns all of life into a liturgy. Prayers are viewed as incense rising before the throne. Financial gifts and acts of charity to the poor are fragrant offerings. Physical bodies are presented as living sacrifices.
Wow.
The entire life of the believer becomes a cohesive liturgical act, mediating the presence of God to a broken world, just like the physical tabernacle mediated God's presence in the wilderness.
But here is where we see the most radical shift of all. We have to look at how the mechanism of holiness itself functioned in the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant.
Okay, lay it out.
The spatial arrangement of the earthly tabernacle taught a vital visual lesson. The camp was arranged with the tabernacle at the absolute center, and it radiated holiness outward in concentric circles of decreasing sanctity. The closer you got to the center, the holier you had to be.
Right. And in that system, sin, disease, and impurity were treated as spiritual contagions. They were essentially biohazards that threatened to defile the sanctuary and provoke the lethal wrath of a holy God. To approach God required meticulous ritual purification.
Yeah.
If a priest touched a leper or a corpse or even just had mildew in his house, the priest became unclean, the impurity was highly contagious, the bad infected the good.
But in the New Covenant, the substance of this shadow is internalized. The believer's physical body is now the temple of the Holy Spirit.
And this is where my mind was blown, because the dynamic of contagion entirely reverses. In the Old Testament, holiness was like a fragile bubble. It could easily be popped by the virus of sin or impurity. But New Covenant holiness is like a reverse virus.
A reverse virus. That is a brilliant way to conceptualize what the sources describe. When Jesus, who is the ultimate substance of holiness, touches the leper in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't become unclean. The leper becomes clean. The holiness is what is contagious now.
That is staggering when you think about the practical implications. Believers don't have to retreat from the world into holy huddles or monasteries to maintain their purity. Because they host the divine presence internally, they are the carriers of this substantial, purifying presence of Christ.
Right.
They are designed to go out into the dark, profane, diseased places of the world and infect them with holiness, transforming the profane into the sacred.
It expands the borders of the heavenly sanctuary outward into the world. It is the ultimate triumph of the substance over the shadow.
It is just incredible to marvel at how a single linguistic thread, this idea of a shadow and a body, weaves its way through ancient wilderness architecture, through historical debates with Greek philosophers, through the fiery structural debates of the Reformation, all the way down to how we interact with a sick neighbor today.
If we synthesize this entire journey, we have traced the blueprint of the tabernacle from its origin in the mind of God into a physical, localized shadow on the earth in the desert, and finally into the absolute eschatological substance of Christ. And that substance now resides both in the heavenly sanctuary and, remarkably, within the believer.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. Because all of this intense theology, all of these Greek words and spatial theories ultimately demand a personal orientation.
Exactly.
Where are you living? Are you living on the exhausting treadmill of the shadows, constantly striving, constantly trying to measure up to an external code, treating your holiness like a fragile bubble that you have to protect from the world? Or are you resting in the substance? Are you living as a carrier of that contagious reverse virus holiness?
It changes the entire posture of a life. It moves you from a posture of fear and preservation to a posture of bold outward expansion.
It really does.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, drawing on a specific verse mentioned in our sources, Revelation 21:22. We've talked about the relentless expansion of God's presence, from a localized garden in Eden to a shadowy tent in the wilderness, to a stone temple in Jerusalem, to the physical body of Jesus, to the heavenly sanctuary, and now internal to the believer.
It's an ever-expanding reality.
It is, but Revelation points to the end of the story, the final reality of the New Jerusalem. And it says that in that final city, there is no physical temple at all, because the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple.
The shadow is entirely gone. The boundaries are gone.
Exactly. So here is the question to ponder. If the trajectory of biblical history is of the relentless, unstoppable expansion of God's unmediated presence, what does that mean for the ultimate future of the universe? When the shadow is entirely gone and the veil is fully removed, does the entire cosmos become the Holy of Holies? Does the universe itself become the inner room of the tabernacle? Something for you to ponder on your own. Thank you so much for bringing us such profound source material and for joining us on this deep dive.